Notebook 7. The Bloody and Futile Offensive of September 25. From the 27th of September, 1915, to the 15th of November, 1915. Part 2. It was the 5th of October. 10 days earlier, a general offensive had begun against the Germans across the front, and the 280th Regiment took part in it. For 10 days, Barthas and his comrades suffered terribly, having to live in devastated trenches filled with corpses under almost continuous freezing and torrential rains, and suffering massacres by grenades, bullets, and shells in a labyrinth of narrow trenches, while disconnected superiors like General Niesel used their lives carelessly, planning futile offensives with no support and in terrible conditions against well-defended German positions. Thousands of lives had already been spent for advances of but a few hundred meters. Now we go back to where we left off, after Barthas and his comrades had to stay in a half-crouch in a narrow trench for 15 hours, waiting anxiously for an attack that in the end did not take place, and then being sent on a 3.5-hour march to reach the town of Meril. They spent 4 days of rest in Meril. During one of those days, Barthas attended service at the town's church, where they venerated the relics of a saint who drew pilgrims from all around because they had the reputation of healing illnesses of the eyes. Barthas discovered that a few days earlier a big shell had fallen right on the church and pulverized everything in the choir except the glass reliquary which contained the saint's bones. The priest was absolutely convinced that this was a genuine divine miracle, and he would not stop talking about it. After those 4 days of rest in Meril, on October 9th, the 280th Regiment was ordered to move back to the front line. At 7 p.m. they were assembled and ready to leave when a counter-order arrived that sent them in the opposite direction, away from Neuville-Saint-Vaast. After an hour and a half of marching, they arrived at their new destination, the village of Agnelles-les-Dussans. They were informed that the 21st Company would be billeted in the outbuildings of the chateau where General Niesel had installed himself like a lord. Barthas and his comrades were happy at first, believing that being this close to the general's residence meant they would be given good lodgings, but then were greatly disappointed when they were sent to a stable with a thick layer of manure which covered the floor. 100 men would have had difficulty sleeping there. They were piling up 250, and additionally they had to make room for 50 sappers. Barthas desperately looked for any other shelter suitable for spending the night, but he found nothing, and was forced to return to the stable. The poilus arrayed themselves as best they could, lying one on top of another in every position. It was impossible to sleep, as someone was always coming in or going out, which could not be done without stepping on people and provoking angry shouts and complaints. As soon as day broke, many of the poilus, including Barthas, went out into the courtyard and started doing vigorous calisthenics to battle the bitter cold. He said that, like good French southerners, they intentionally made as much noise as possible, thinking about nothing but interrupting General Niesel's sleep, or his strategic meditations, or perhaps even his love-making, for it was said that the general and the pretty lady of the manor were on very friendly terms. Suddenly, a door of the chateau burst open, and the general appeared, bareheaded and with an angry scowl. He cried out in an angry voice, "Would you please shut up, or I'll have you sent to the trenches right away. Go back to bed and get some rest." He talked to them just like a master talks to his dogs, and he granted them permission to go to bed without even considering that they had no suitable place to go to sleep. The next morning the general was in a better mood. He came to the courtyard with packets of 1-penny pencils which he had distributed among the soldiers. The poilus were confused by this strange gesture. When asked by his comrades, Barthas told them that he did not know what it meant, but that they'd soon see that Nizel was preparing an unpleasant surprise for them. Indeed, at 10:30, they had barely finished their meals when the order was given to immediately go to the trenches. On the way there, the officers told them the 280th Regiment was going to support a divisional attack. But when they had gone past Neuville-Saint-Vaast, the Germans unleashed a violent bombardment on them, and all the soldiers fell back to Neuville in flight. Barthas complained that others would take this as evidence that French Southerners were cowards, always ready to flee and never fight. But he commented that in their ranks there were also Parisians and Bretons, and they ran just as fast as everyone else. When the fighting began, Commandant Cansgram and Captain Croix-Meireville immediately took refuge in a nearby big shelter. When it finally stopped, they sent their orderlies to gather up the soldiers, but it was difficult. They were all widely scattered. Meanwhile, the attack took place, but two sections of the 281st Regiment went over the top and were immediately cut down by machine gun fire, and no one else wanted to go out despite repeated orders from the general. At 7 p.m., Barthas's company went to reinforce the 281st Regiment, and they occupied a very damaged communication trench, spending an unpleasant night exposed to frequent German bombardment. The next day, October 12th, they were sent back to the front line and fully relieved the 281st Regiment. At the firing line, they noticed assault ladders placed every 10 meters along the parapet. The sight made them shiver, as if they were walking past gallows. In their trench there were also the remnants of a German heavy artillery battery, which had been wiped out by the French artillery. Cannons, equipment, tools, and corpses were all buried in a muddy and bloody mess. The poilus were immediately put to work day and night digging dugouts in that trench. Right behind and in front of their line there were many dead, in a proportion of about 1 German for every 20 Frenchmen. The French corpses belonged to the 50th Infantry Regiment. A terrible price in blood had been paid for a meaningless advance of 700 or 800 meters. They were now attacking trenches that were just as solidly defended as the ones they had taken. Each morning there, a thick fog covered the landscape, and some of the men used this to go out and get rifles, revolvers, and other things from the corpses. Some of the less scrupulous went through the pockets of the dead men. One morning, a corporal from their company, called Cathala, was wounded badly in the leg by a bullet while out on one of these expeditions and had to drag himself back to the trench. The leg would later have to be amputated. The poilus were staunching his wound when General Nizel himself appeared. He was often there in the trenches at daybreak, when all was calm. "Ah," he said, "where was this corporal wounded?" The poilus could not tell him that the corporal had been looting the pockets of dead men, so they said it was at an observation post. The general immediately called the company's captain. "Are you satisfied with this soldier's conduct?" he asked. The confused captain stammered, "Yes, very satisfied." "Very well," said the general. "He will be commended and will get the Croix de Guerre and the Médaille Militaire." And so Corporal Cathala, the looter of corpses, became a hero. Life continued, and during those days Father Galop became obsessed with finding a German rifle with a saw-toothed bayonet to take home as a souvenir. The Germans had one of these saw-toothed bayonets in each squad. They were meant to be used when it was necessary to cut a branch or a wooden plank, though that did not prevent it from being used to kill and cut through people. Each morning Father Galop would go out into the fog in search of one of these instruments, at the risk of being caught by a bullet. One day Gallo told Barthas that if he wanted a revolver and a good pair of binoculars, he could point them out to him. Barthas accepted the offer, and was led the next morning to a place where a huge shell had fallen, right in the middle of a group of French soldiers who had been mounting an assault, decapitating and mutilating a dozen men, leaving them as nothing more than bloody scraps. There Barthas found the binoculars and the revolver still in their leather cases. He quickly grabbed them and fled the horrible scene. With help of those binoculars, Gallo eventually found his saw-toothed bayonet, a few paces away from the trench, at the end of a rifle held by a dead German tangled in the barbed wire. The following night, at enormous and foolish risk, the priest went out into the darkness and managed to get his precious bayonet without alerting the Germans. But, on his way back, he got lost and fell into the listening post of a neighboring company, where the two sentinels fired at him before recognizing him, though fortunately they missed. After that, at the very moment Gallo was leaving the listening post, a 105mm shell fell right into it, immediately killing the two sentinels. Father Gallo thanked Providence for protecting him from such serious danger in his rash enterprise. Meanwhile, the sub-lieutenant Malvezy became jealous of Barthas's new binoculars, and tried to exchange them for his own, cheap binoculars. Barthas refused emphatically, and Malvezy left with a grudge for which he would enact petty vengeance later. After that, on October 17th, at 9 in the evening, a shell exploded right in the trench, 30 meters from Barthas's position, killing two unlucky rationers who were bringing food to their squad. One of these had been a friend of Barthas called Vieux. At first he had been attached to Barthas's squad, though soon afterward he was transferred to the 18th Company, where his brother was a rationer for the officers. A short time afterwards, that brother was also killed. Barthas wrote that they had been two good and sincere socialist militants from the village of Macabardet, and he was angry at their deaths. And the death of those two brothers was only a small part of the daily tragedies. During their stay at the trenches, the neighboring 18th Company suffered a lot, having 20 men killed or wounded, while Barthas's own 21st Company only had 3 wounded. This was because the 21st was so close to the German positions that the German artillery did not dare fire on them, for fear of hitting their own. After that, one particular day, without warning or explanation, Father Gallo started firing out of a loophole at the Germans like a madman, with the rifle he had recently acquired. Barthas warned him, "Who lives by the sword will die by the sword," but Gallo ignored him and continued firing away. The Germans went for many hours without firing a shot, but eventually they began to reply to the priest's fusillade. They soon discovered the loophole from which Gallo was firing, and immediately a bullet passed through it, shattering the wrist of the priest before going through his helmet and grazing his forehead. Father Gallo was then taken to the first aid station and evacuated to a military hospital, from which he sent the squad his greetings and best wishes. After that, on the last day of their frontline assignment, General Niesel came to the trenches. He first went to the neighboring 18th Company. Barthas's squad was nearby, and they could hear how the general chewed out a sentry who had not made a sign of respect to him. Barthas remarked that out of the trenches the general did not fool around with respect, demanding that soldiers salute his staff car when it passed by, no matter whether the general was in it or not. Then the general suddenly came face to face with Commandant de Fajols of the 18th Company, and started chewing him out too. The general had not forgiven de Fajols for refusing to have his battalion massacred at the regiment's last assault. Niesel complained that in 2 weeks the Germans had done too much, while the French had achieved nothing. And he meant to change it, and they would soon have to attack, either that day or the next one. At an attempt at a humble interruption by the commandant, the general got more and more worked up, to the point that he was shouting, and it was certain the Germans could hear him. The general mocked the commandant and the filthy state of the soldiers' uniforms, saying that they all looked like no more than a militia. Then he turned to Barthas and said angrily, "Have you passed the word that I am here? It's been 20 minutes and no one has come to meet me." "Excuse me, General," said Barthas. "I told my sergeant that you were here." "So that's how your captain takes care of business. We'll go have a look." Barthas said that unfortunately he could not move from his position and witness it personally, but their hated captain Croix-Meyreville had to take all the heat according to his rank. The general mistreated his officers like simpletons, with no regards for their positions. That same day, the poilus learned that, contrary to General Niesel's wishes, the offensive was being halted everywhere along the front. This took an enormous weight off their shoulders, and they happily made their way back to the town of Meruel. The next day they were informed that each company had to form a section specialized in throwing grenades, with preference going to young, vigorous men. In their section, Sub-Lieutenant Malvezy had to choose the Grenadier section's corporal, and he immediately chose Barthas, despite the fact that he was the oldest of the 4 corporals. This was Malvezy's petty revenge against Barthas for having better binoculars than his own. Barthas could have complained, but he thought that perhaps up at the listening posts where the grenadiers would be stationed, he would be safer. Indeed, he would be more exposed to grenades and surprise attacks, but less exposed to shells and mortar fire than farther in the rear. So, Barthas left his squad and joined the Grenadier section. The next day of supposed rest, the Grenadier section was sent to work at the front lines digging a communication trench. They headed out at 6 in the evening and returned at 4 in the morning, having to cover 20 kilometers in total. One of the men did not return, having been killed outright by a stray bullet. Nobody wept for him. They were too preoccupied with their own suffering. During the day they were kept busy by tossing stones instead of grenades from morning to night in order to build their throwing arms. By the end of 4 days they had all terribly strained their shoulders. On October 23rd at 6 p.m. they were sent to the village of Agnes for 4 more days. This time they were housed in a different chateau from the one the general was in. As a bed and pillow they had piles of hay and straw, which were filled with ticks and fleas. Barthas wrote that chateau was a true nest of shirkers from the whole division, full of telephone operators, stenographers, stretcher-bearers, and gendarmes. All of these men occupied the best spots, and looked down at the poilus with visible disdain. One afternoon there, all the sergeants and corporals were summoned by General Niesel for a conference about their role in the trenches during the upcoming winter campaign. For hours the general went on and on about how they would assault and raid the German trenches, constantly remarking how it would all be very easy, and how they all looked like good, sturdy men who could handle themselves. Eventually the general finished his speech, thanked them for their attention, which had been compulsory, and left, no doubt convinced that he had excited their patriotism and warrior spirit. Barthas said he couldn't have been farther from the truth. Later, on October 25th, it was decided that before going back to the trenches, the soldiers would carry out a long march, where the rules would be observed strictly, to get them back into proper disciplinary shape. The sergeant that was head of the company's grenadiers was on leave, so Barthas was again promoted against his best wishes to the temporary head of the grenadier section. It was supposed to be an elite group, but in reality it was the unit where each squad had sent its biggest malcontents. Despite there being rain, they set out at noon, the grenadiers in line of march. Fearing meeting General Niesel, the scourge of all officers, their captain insisted on perfect marching order as they passed through the village of Agnew. It was the grenadiers' bad luck that, as they marched out of their camp, 3 or 4 trucks crossed their paths, separating their section and completely disorganizing them. When the captain noticed this, he was furious and did not listen to Barthas's explanation. For a full half-hour, he put them through close-order drills, making them all repeat the same maneuvers over and over again until he got tired of giving orders and went to bother other parts of the company. The whole march was a tiring, dull bother. With his horse, the captain made them keep to the edge of the road, even though there were big puddles and mud holes, because it was what was written in the rule book. When they passed through the village of Montcourt, the grenadier section came back into the captain's good graces. They had paraded in an impeccable fashion, while the rest of the company marched like firemen. As a reward, the captain let them march at a normal walking pace, while the others had to march briskly at cadenced pace, with arms shouldered. The grenadiers could now have some fun, except for 2 who had been given 4 days in prison, one for taking a puff on a pipe he had kept hidden in his hand while they were marching, and another for not being capable of keeping his mouth shut, forgetting that at cadenced pace they were supposed to keep perfectly quiet. After that, on October 28th, at 5 in the afternoon, under heavy and cold downpours, they headed out to occupy reserve trenches near Neuville-Saint-Vaast. They dragged themselves as best they could, only to reach a gloomy communication trench full of mud, where the men argued with each other over half-collapsed holes. Only the officers had halfway decent shelters. Barthas wrote that a few slabs of metal or some planks with dirt on top would have been enough to at least protect them from the heavy rains and freezing winds. But, like everywhere else, nothing had been planned or organized to shelter the soldiers. 2 days later, at nightfall, their company went up to occupy a second-line trench called the Tranchée du Moulin, the trench of the mill. There had indeed once been a mill nearby. Barthas spotted it 3 days later. Nothing left of it but a few bricks sticking out of the earth and mud. At their emplacement, the grenadier section was housed in an abandoned and incomplete German mine. It was nothing more than a staircase of about 40 steps dug into the earth with a low, narrow corridor at the bottom. So little air got down that far that candles wouldn't even stay lit in the corridor. There was so little room there that the grenadiers had to leave their weapons and packs outside at the mercy of the rain and anyone with a thieving streak. Barthas wrote that anyone who thought their bedrooms were not comfortable or spacious enough should consider how comfortable it was for 40 men on that narrow, muddy, and slippery staircase where someone was always going up or down and where there was not enough room for 2 slightly overweight men to pass each other. Though he mentioned that luckily they were all pretty thin by that point. The opening of their staircase faced the German lines, and it was quite possible for a shell to suddenly fall down the staircase and blow them all to pieces. But, among all the dangers and miseries of their lives, no one gave that a second thought. Besides, they barely spent time there. Their captain constantly sent orderlies to put them in work details under the rain. Since they had arrived at the trench of the mill, it had rained practically non-stop. On the 2nd of November it was truly raining in torrents, and the trenches had been transformed into sewers. That night, in full deluge, Barthas received the order to put all the grenadiers to work, cleaning out a communication trench all night long. It was a stupid, senseless, and barbarous order. They would have to labor in absolute darkness, in mud and freezing water, while the rain undid whatever work they did. A true Sisyphean task. The men said they would not work. Barthas wrote on the back of the order the reasons why it would be better if they waited for the rain to stop, and sent it back to the captain. 30 minutes later he received an ultimatum, which demanded that they get to work immediately, saying that Barthas would be responsible for the execution of this order, and that the captain would personally go to inspect the work they did. Under the light of an electric lamp, Barthas wrote his response. Captain, I know the limits of work, of effort, of fatigue which one can ask of a man. My conscience won't allow me to go beyond those limits. Either grant me that, or give my command to someone else. A minute later, the rain-soaked orderly reappeared, with the order that Barthas present himself before the captain immediately. And so Barthas had to go. The captain was installed in a deep shelter. Seated at a little table, he was enjoying a nice game of cards with a lieutenant. To the side, a brazier gave off a lovely warmth, and an aide was heating up a teapot. The situation of the officers and the situation of the poilus were worlds apart. The captain said dryly, Corporal, by order of the commandant, you have to put your men to work all night long, to keep the communication trench passable up to the front lines. Go to it. Captain, said Barthas, as long as the rain is coming down in torrents, I'm not going to have my men out there working, because their efforts would be useless, and all their fatigue, their suffering, would be for nothing. And besides, they wouldn't obey me. I repeat, it's the commandant's order, said the captain. And I repeat that this order can't be carried out, Barthas replied. Please give the command of the grenadier section to another non-com. It is not for me, a simple corporal, to be in charge. The captain stood up in a rage. Corporal Barthas, for the last time, I'm demanding that you execute this order. I'm holding you responsible. I'll come to see for myself. Now get out of here. 15 minutes later, after almost drowning in the torrential rain, Barthas stumbled to the narrow entrance of the grenadiers' staircase, which was so tightly packed that anyone who went outside wouldn't find a place again. Shivering, wondering if he would die of cold or exhaustion in this trench, Barthas was tortured by moral distress. The inhuman orders to throw those 40 men, already frozen to the bone, into the terrible rain and mud, to work futilely against the elements, filled Barthas with rage. He had made his decision. He would defy the captain and the commandant's direct orders, and the men would stay in their shelter. Maybe the next day Barthas would be arrested and dragged to a court-martial for refusing to obey a direct order. Perhaps they could even have him shot as an example for the others. Troubling, desperate thoughts invaded Barthas's brain. They would not get to him. For a moment he considered that before dying he would go back to the captain's lair and skewer him with his bayonet like a beast. Then another thought came to him. The corridor at the bottom of the grenadier's staircase. So little air made it down there that candles wouldn't stay lit, and no one dared to sleep down there, instead piling up on the stairs. Barthas decided. He would go down there and sleep. By the next day he would likely be asphyxiated. It would be a nice, painless death, an end to this cruel life. The thought of his loved ones did not hold him back in the least. He had given up hope of seeing them ever again a long time ago. Barthas grabbed his pack and made his way down the narrow staircase, stepping and slipping on legs, feet, backs, and bellies, provoking angry growls and grumbles. Finally, he got to the bottom, took off his dripping clothes, and wrapped himself in his blanket, abandoning himself to the sleep of death. At midnight, he was shaken awake. "Let me die in peace," Barthas cried out. "Are you crazy?" replied the captain's orderly. "Here, read this paper." It was a note from the captain demanding that Barthas report their progress. Barthas wrote his reply, lying that the soldiers were working on some of the trenches. The orderly was a good man, and Barthas knew he wouldn't betray him. Finally, day came, and the grenadiers left the staircase and stretched out. The rain had finally ceased. The men knew Barthas had refused to make them work at night in the rain, so now they grabbed their picks and shovels and worked with a burst of energy and enthusiasm. At around 10 a.m., the commandant and the captain came to pay them a visit. The captain looked around suspiciously. "So this is what you've done since last evening, with 40 men?" He did not press the matter further, and that was how Barthas got out of that situation. Life moved on. Another small detail of life in that sector was that the rain provoked landslides in the trench, which uncovered many French corpses from the attack of September 25. These corpses had been buried with insufficient dirt, and it was not uncommon to be grabbed by a skeletal hand or foot which was sticking out of the trench wall. The poilus paid it no more attention than a root on which they might trip. Finally, on November 6th, at 6 in the evening, their regiment was relieved, and they left that hellhole. They went back to Agnes, and stayed there until the 13th, being forced to carry out the usual stupid exercises and drills whenever there was clear weather. On November 13th, at nightfall, they were sent to the town of Meril, and spent 6 days there in reserve. During the day, Barthas was washing his lice-filled shirt when he looked around the courtyard and spotted an ancient carriage which seemed to date from 100 years ago. Under it there was a suspicious old piece of cloth, which Barthas moved with a stick, and before him was revealed a pleasant surprise. 2 plump hens which without doubt had been sacrificed by some shameless poilu who was waiting for nightfall to take them away. Barthas quickly alerted his fellow grenadier Segail, a sly rascal who affirmed that, since in wartime they were permitted, and even ordered to kill, it was a minor peccadillo to wring the neck of a hen. Furthermore, Segail was an excellent chef who could teach a cordon bleu a thing or two. It was child's play for him to take the hens away from the courtyard without being seen, and then, in the evening, in a half-demolished house that still had its kitchen intact, Segail skillfully cooked up the 2 birds in mess tins, and Barthas and Segail, together with 2 other comrades, enjoyed a double pleasure, that of an excellent meal, and that of outsmarting a thief. Life continued, and those were difficult days. The soldiers were made to work and march in the trenches all night long, with hardly anything to eat, while their officers drank, sang, and enjoyed themselves in the village. It was disgusting, and eventually led some of the men to revolt. At 6 in the evening came the usual assembly. Only the grenadier section did not move. Everyone claimed to be sick. When they were called out individually, many got scared and declared themselves cured. The others were sent before their new medical officer, Dr. Colombier, a worthy disciple and successor to the chief major, which had caused them all so much pain before being promoted to a position outside the regiment. The doctor was furious at being interrupted from his enjoyable supper with the other officers. "Ah," he said, Here are the laggards who don't want to work. We'll see about them. Unsurprisingly, no one was accepted into sick bay. No headaches, colics, back pains, or other pains were accepted. Now, refusing to work without medical leave was very serious business. It meant prison for sure, and possibly even a court-martial. Only one private, whose name Barthas did not give, kept claiming he was ill, and went back to bed. The rest left to work, but in sign of protest they crossed the village singing the Internationale, which for Barthas would always be the hymn of the oppressed, the ones for whom it was an expression of discontent and hope. And here we reach the end of the 7th notebook. At last it seems that the offensive that started on the 25th of September has lost its impetus, with attacks being stopped all along the sector. Still, the suffering of the soldiers remains great, both in the trenches and behind the lines, with their officers treating them like servants and showing no care for their situation. We can already see that these things are making the patience of many of the men run out. Only time will tell where this all will lead. Until then, I hope you all stay well, and I shall see you in the 8th notebook.